Hello and welcome to the second episode of Stories from Strathmore with me, Jimmy Black. Death is a subject which most people avoid or laugh about nervously. But when Kathleen Kench of Coupar Angus was growing up, death was the family business. I spoke to Mrs. Kench about her childhood in an undertaker's house in the 1920s. Was it your father that was an undertaker?
Yes.
What was his name?
James Hunter.
And he was an undertaker in Coupar Angus?
He was an undertaker in a business that was formed in 1846 by my great-grandfather, George MacDonald.
Were the funerals in the old days any different from the way they are now?
Oh, they were very much different. I've known a funeral that could last 2 days if they were going some distance. And when they went away to the funerals, it was horse and cart, of course, in these days. And they usually took a supply of food with them, sandwiches, and a little supply of liquid nourishment in case it would be cold. And they would leave Coupar Angus, and it would be 2 days before they would be back, depending on where the funeral was going to be. Sometimes they had funerals to places like Moulin.
That's up by Perthshire?
That's right, yes. If it was to Moulin, it might be 3 days, because they needed more rest. And they would be all dressed up with their tailcoats, towel hats, as befitting to the undertaker. And the mourners that went, they were always dressed as well. There was nobody going in jeans and jerseys and things at that time. It wasn't on.
What were the horses like?
Oh, they were Clydesdale horses. Heavy horses and heavy carts.
In the days when telephones were not so common, a knock on the door was the usual signal for the undertaker to go about his work.
The relative would come and tell them that they had died and ask them to come along to the house and bring his rule. He always took the rule to measure the body, and he would go along and measure the body and find out and add a few inches, because the coffin always had to be longer than the body because the body stretched. It was very important that the coffin would be a few inches longer, because you could imagine the hassle if the body didn't fit in at the end of it all.
Making a coffin was much more than just knocking up a box. The undertaker lavished care and attention in getting it just right.
He kept the wood in his loft. The wood had been stored for many years. It was shrunk. The wood was always kept for a long time, so as it would be shrunk. So as when they came to make the coffin, that he wouldn't shrink any more. And then they would proceed to wet the wood, steam the wood, and bend it into the shape of the coffin. Then they would get the wood, the coffin shaped how they wanted it, the right length and a few inches to spare. And then they would put sticky resin stuff hot inside the coffin to sort of render it watertight, and so as that the trappings of the coffin would stick. And then the outside of the coffins, depending on the age of the person, black material if it was elderly, purple mauve material for middle-aged, and white for children under 14. All children under 14 had a white coffin.
Children on farms get used to cows and sheep. Fishermen's children get used to fish. And undertakers' children must get used to having dead bodies about the place. Mrs. Kench remembers some of the superstition that surrounded the handling of corpses.
In these days it was customary for people to go and see the body. They didn't screw it down, as they talk about now in the modern world. And of course it was considered extremely bad luck if you didn't touch the brow of the deceased. And even as children, we were quite often taken along with my mother to see these bodies. And I can remember the very first time that she put my hand in, it was so cold and I was really frightened. I think it was quite a grim thing to take young children. I wasn't very old. I would be about 5 or 6.
Didn't give you nightmares?
No, never, no.
Can you actually remember doing it?
Yes, I can remember doing it. I can remember doing it to this old lady, and she was old and wrinkly, and I remember that she had a bonnet on, because she had always been in the habit of wearing a mutch, they called them in these days. So it was befitting when she died, that she would have her mutch on, and she had her mutch, and we had to push the mutch just a little bit back to get a right feel of the forehead. But it never really upset me. It seemed to be just something, and I just grew up with it.
There are other things like always taking the body feet first and things like that.
That's right. You must take the body feet first when you're taking it out. That signified that the patient is actually dead.
There was a lighter side to all this, and just as well. Perhaps laughter is the best way of keeping extraordinary things like death in perspective.
My uncle in Spitalfield, who was also an undertaker, and he went in for a Red Cross competition at Spitalfield, and he lost the team the cup because he carried his casualty out feet first. And it wasn't dead. And then there was a write up in the papers about this incident, and then it said, but we have forgiven George Kidd, considering that he is the local undertaker.
Oh dear.
One funny incident I can remember, and it was in the churchyard, and it was a local person, but his relative came from London to the funeral. So this gentleman arrived, and it was a rather windy day, and they were standing at the graveside, and he took off his style hat, of course, this was the thing, and everybody had been saying how well he looked, that he hadn't aged at all, but unfortunately a gust came along and blew off Willie's wig, which arrived in beside the coffin.
So who got the job of getting it out?
Nobody. He just put on his style hat and sort of tried to ignore the whole situation and put his hat on because he really didn't want people to know that he had this wig. Oh, yes, this old gentleman and his wife came along and said that he had passed away and would come along. So he got the rule as the custom, and along he goes to this house, and here's this old man lying in the back. So he turned back the sheets and got out his rule, and he had got him about half measured when the man sat up and said, "Oh, it's you, how big am I?"
Well, that's Stories from Strathmore finished for another week. Hope we haven't given you nightmares with our grisly tales. Later in the series we'll be moving elsewhere in the Strath, but next time we'll be in Coupar Angus again, meeting one of Strathmore's keenest amateur historians, Joe Richards. So from me, Jimmy Black, it's cheerio till then.